Geoffrey Nice, who's an Emeritus Professor of Law at Gresham College, and he joins us live from Canterbury in the UK. Thanks very much indeed for being with us today. So this is an interesting case, isn't it, involving a former child soldier. So what do judges have to weigh up in this kind of scenario when someone who was a victim has become the perpetrator?
Well, they simply have to decide whether by the time he was committing the acts that they have judged were crimes, he was responsible for his actions. They've decided that he was. Your viewers may like to just think a little bit around this conviction, remembering that, for example, in domestic jurisdictions, sex offenders against children have normally been themselves subject to sex offences as children. They have to think that the perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust were driven by unstoppable forces, as they would say, to commit crimes. And it's these big issues that are determined by this decision, which has put victims ahead of what might be argued on behalf of perpetrators. And that will have an effect, I think, not just on international law, but on the perception of criminality in national and international jurisdictions.
So do you think it sends some kind of precedent then? It sets some kind of precedent, rather?
Whether it's a precedent, well, it's certainly a precedent in this very particular and unusual type of crime, but I hope that it will broaden out the thinking about criminality, because in domestic and international circumstances, people look at correctly look at the victim and say that victim must be compensated for, must receive justice. But it's difficult to match that absolute need for justice against what may, in certain circumstances, have made it difficult or impossible for the offender not to do what he did. Now, the judges in this case made it quite clear. They said the others who could have escaped did escape. He chose to stay on. But had he already had a mind changed that made it desirable, impossible for him not to stay on, or was he born at birth with some kind of criminality that led to what he did? And these fascinating and difficult problems are things that civilizations have always had to address but failed to, but with this judgment may start thinking in a more detailed way.
And this was a case which featured many particularly nasty examples of using violence against women as a weapon of war.
Yeah, absolutely horrible crimes. And does that make the underlying issue any easier or more difficult? If I go back to the example of the domestic sexual abuse crime, crimes that have been committed by people against children, young children, very young children, are unbelievably awful. And you then discover that the offender has himself been subject to such unbelievably awful crimes. Does one in any way balance the other, or do we have to assume or find, as this court did, that after a certain point in time, sorry, whatever happened before is irrelevant. You are now responsible for this that happens from this moment on. It's a big social, legal issue for states and for the international law.
Really interesting discussion. Geoffrey Nice, Emeritus Professor of Law at Gresham College, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.